We are edging towards the unimaginable, a power keg that risks engulfing the world.
Under the shadows of conflicts around the world, the United Nations General Assembly kicks off in New York. We will discuss what can be done to achieve peace. Hello, I'm Anton Fedyashin, and this is The Heat. More than 100 conflicts are raging across the world, impacting millions. The United Nations General Assembly started on Tuesday with the difficult task to get countries to work together towards peace. We will discuss how that can be achieved, but first I spoke with the UN Under-Secretary General for Peace Operations, Jean-Pierre Lacroix, and started by asking him about the key challenges for UN peacekeeping.
I think the main one has been the increased divisions across the membership of the United Nations, the more polarized international community, and that is our major challenge, because we need to rely on the support and unity and commitment of our member states to support not only the peacekeeping operation but also the political processes, the political efforts towards a political solution. So that's a main challenge. The other one, I believe, is the evolving nature of conflict, with the increased role of non-state actors, armed groups involved in transnational criminal activity, terrorism, the role of private security companies in some situations, and of course the increased impact of digital technologies. Of course, digital technology have lots of positive impact, but also there can be negative impact in terms of more sophisticated attacks against the civilians and against the peacekeepers, and also fake news and disinformation. Disinformation has become a weapon, and it's enabled, and it's enhanced by digital technologies.
China is an important part of UN peacekeeping. It is the second largest financial contributor, and it also provides more than 2,000 troops. How does that impact your mission?
Well, I think the role of China is very important, because it's one of the largest troop contributing countries to peacekeeping, and it's also, of course, one of the major financial contributors. In addition, of course, to China being a permanent member of the Security Council. But then in addition to that, I think that we've been constantly supported by China in our efforts to improve the impact and the effectiveness of peacekeeping. It is tremendously important, because peacekeeping, in spite of the challenges that I mentioned, continue to make a huge difference in many conflict situations, in terms of preserving ceasefires, in terms of protecting hundreds of thousands of civilians, and supporting the host states in the capacity building. And therefore, the support of China to us trying to improve the effectiveness of peacekeeping is tremendously important.
You were talking a moment ago about the evolving nature of conflicts around the world. According to some estimates, there are currently more than 100 conflicts around the world, which is impacting millions of people. Why are we seeing this escalation right now?
Well, I think that obviously, in addition to divisions and polarization, in the international community, there are underlying issues which I believe are quite eloquently reflected in the Pact for the Future, the document that was just adopted by member states at the Summit of the Future. We're talking about the impact of inequality, the shortcomings in terms of achieving progress for the Sustainable Development Goals, the role of drivers of conflict, such as the impact of climate change, which results in the harsher competition for natural resources. Also the impact of transnational criminal activities. I mean, all of these really are major drivers of conflict. And then, if they are compounded by increased division across member states, then you end up the proliferation of conflict, which is, of course, of devastating consequences to the world's population and in so many different areas, and also with the impact in terms of opportunities lost for development.
Two of the most high-profile conflict zones that we're seeing right now are Gaza and in Ukraine as well. We're also seeing a spike in military confrontation between Israel and Hezbollah. What are the long-term consequences of these crises?
Well, I think that obviously it's critically important when we see the latest escalation in Lebanon. To continue our urgent calls, as did our UN Secretary General this morning, for cessation of hostilities and a recommitment to a political solution, for which there is a framework, which is Security Council Resolution 1701, and of course you're aware of all the efforts and the calls for equally cessation of hostility in Gaza, as well as the solution for the Ukraine conflict in line with the charters of the United Nations and the General Assembly resolution. It is more important than ever to continue our efforts, however challenging and even frustrating it can be, because the longer these conflicts continue, and of course, in addition to these conflicts, you have the devastating conflict in Sudan and in Libya and so many other parts of the world. The long-term consequences, essentially, in addition to the short-term, which is lives being losses and destructions, is the opportunities. I mentioned the opportunity lost, for development, for taking forward innovation. The attention that is diverted from addressing the key global challenges, such as climate change, which should be really at the center of the international community's concern and focus. So I believe these are some of the consequences of this conflict.
Looking at the role the UN should and can play in maintaining peace and security, you said recently that deep divisions between the world's most powerful nations have undermined UN efforts to promote peace and security. Why is that, and what's the way forward?
The way forward, if I may say so, and of course I know it's challenging and very aspirational, but it is critically important that member states should reach common agreement on what are the key challenges, what are the key global challenges to the world and to the world's peace and security, and also an agreement on how those challenges need to be addressed. And obviously these challenges, I mentioned climate change, I mentioned the need to accelerate the efforts towards the Sustainable Development Goals. I mentioned transnational criminal activities, illegal exploitation, natural resources, and all this. I mean, these are issues that cannot be dealt with effectively by a single group of member states or a single member state. These are issues that need to be addressed collectively. And I believe that the goal of the Summit of the Future, the Pact of the Future, is really to try to bring about consensus on the critical importance of addressing these challenges on the basis of multilateral approaches, which obviously requires not only more unity amongst member states, but also changes in the way the multilateral system is organized and functions, and hence the calls for reforming the Security Council as well as the multilateral financial system.
That was UN Under-Secretary General for Peace Operations, Jean-Pierre Lacroix. Now, to continue our discussion, let's bring in our panelists. From New York, Brian Becker is Executive Director of the Answer Coalition. Here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a history professor at American University. And from Tehran, We're joined by Akbar Dareini. He is a researcher and writer at the Center for Strategic Studies. Welcome to all of you. Anton Fedyashin, I want to start with that statement made by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. We played it out in the beginning there. He said, "We are edging towards the unimaginable, a powder keg that risks engulfing the entire world." I mean, if we just look at two conflicts that are raging right now, we look at Gaza, we look at Ukraine, both of these conflicts have the potential to escalate into much, much wider wars, possibly involving the use of nuclear weapons. How perilous a moment is the world facing right now?
Anand, unfortunately, quite perilous. And I share Mr. Guterres' concern over this. It's a fairly unprecedented situation in which two nuclear powers, Israel being one of them and Russia being the other one, are on the verge of potentially using those weapons if the conflicts in which they are involved widen. This really is a unique situation because never before has this happened since atomic weapons became an unfortunate reality just over 70 years ago. So all of the risk is there. The question is whether wise diplomacy can find a way out. It's actually less difficult than it ought to be. But one of the things that I did not hear much about today in the UN speeches is a serious diplomatic effort to settle both of these conflicts, especially the Ukrainian one.
Do you get the sense, Anton, that there is a failure to recognize that if these conflicts escalate into much wider wars, that there will, in the end, be no winners?
Yes, there is that failure, unfortunately. And we saw this play out over the past several weeks with the debate over NATO allowing the Ukrainians to use weapons to strike deep into Russia, which means that NATO countries, especially the United States, of course, and satellite system, would be directing those missiles against the Russians, and the Russians threatening a response, which may eventually, although hopefully not from the very beginning, become a nuclear one. I certainly hope that this doesn't happen, but it gives us a sense of just how close we are to the edge.
Brian, the United Nations has not been able to bring either the Ukraine conflict or the Israeli onslaught on Gaza to an end, and it's not for want of trying. I mean, we had South Africa that brought that case at the International Court of Justice against Israel, accusing Israel of committing genocide in Gaza. Would it be fair to say, Brian, that it's just really a handful of countries that are blocking progress towards peace?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It was President Biden's speech, I think, was dripping with hypocrisy today when he talked about tirelessly working for a ceasefire, when in fact, under his direction, under his orders, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations vetoed a UN resolution for a ceasefire twice. The United States continues to finance, fund, and arm the Israeli government, without which the Israeli government couldn't continue the genocide in Gaza, and now the escalating terrorist war undertaken by Israel against the people of Lebanon, now almost 1,000 dead in Lebanon. So, you know, the world made it clear at the United Nations that the world wants a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, and Israel's withdrawal from Gaza. And it was the United States that made that impossible. Now we have a situation where the United States, along with the Ukrainian government today, carried out a performative sideline event at the Security Council at the United Nations, where Zelensky was basically making the offer, or insisting that there not be a peace deal until there's victory over Russia, meaning that they don't want to have the drive for war against Russia drowned out by all of the appeals and cries for peace this week. So that's the real problem. The real problem is a handful of countries, and I would say, unfortunately, principally the United States, that has been the obstacle to real peace. And let me just say, I agree with your earlier assertions in the UN Secretary General. This is a perilous time because the architecture of Cold War diplomacy that began in the 1960s, that created some equilibrium, an architecture of equilibrium, that too has been completely trashed, principally by the United States.
Ali Akbar Dareini, we are seeing a further escalation of violence in the Middle East right now. We've seen Israel carpet bomb parts of Lebanon. That's left up to 1,000 people dead, civilians among them. There's also been a mass terrorist attack using pagers and walkie-talkies that killed and injured thousands of people. I mean, could it lead to a much wider conflict in the Middle East? You know, the Iranian foreign minister said in New York that Iran is not looking for a war with anybody, although US leaders from Biden downwards are blaming Iran for everything that's causing this instability in the Middle East right now.
We should not expect Israel and the Americans to say anything else, because Israel's genocidal war in Gaza is continuing, and it is a dream of Netanyahu to widen the war, to save his own, to save himself. The Netanyahu administration has been trying to provoke Iran into a reaction that will get Iran involved in the war, hoping that, or on the calculation that the Americans will get involved, and then it will turn into a regional war. This has been Israel's policy, but Iran is determined to punish Israel for assassinating Haniyeh in Tehran, for continuing its ethnic cleansing and genocide in Gaza, while avoiding to do that, while avoiding to make sure that Netanyahu will not achieve his goals. But the big reason why there is bloodshed and destruction in Gaza and elsewhere in the Middle East, and now a wider full-fledged war against Lebanon, is the lack of balance of power. The United States is the key player in fueling Israel's war of aggression against Lebanon now. The United States has been shielding, protecting, and arming Israel. The US has vetoed 5 UN Security Council resolutions calling for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza.
Right.
Israel cannot fight for 5 days without US support. But now Iran is pushing for a ceasefire, and Iran's president is calling for that.
Brian, there was a very tough statement from the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, at the United Nations. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Children are not the only ones dying in Gaza. At the same time, the United Nations system is dying. The truth is dying. The values that the West claims to defend are dying.
So, Brian, is the entire system of multilateralism, of cooperation, now in danger of collapse?
Yes, I think it really is. And again, going back to the fact that there is no equilibrium in the world, no power check, as happened when there was a socialist camp in the Soviet Union as a second, maybe equal power, or certainly it had nuclear parity with the United States. There was kind of a checkmate there, or at least check. And we have now a situation where the U.S. aspires still to be the unipolar power in the world. That's been true for the past 30 years. And even though China has emerged, even though Russia is back on its feet, even though regional countries like Iran or Pakistan are major economies that are developing, the United States sees everything as a zero-sum game. The United States sees China's rise or Russia's stabilization or Iran's growth as something as a deficit for the United States. So the U.S. policy, even though not explicitly announced, is to roll back, contain, obstruct, inhibit the growth and development of other major countries. And that's a recipe for real military confrontation. And then in 2018, the Pentagon announced in its quadrennial report that the war on terrorism was no longer the priority of the U.S. The U.S. new priority was major power conflict. Now, that's crazy. That's insanity, but that's actually the priority, the doctrine, and the strategy of the United States.
Right, and Brian, getting back to what Erdogan said at the United Nations, as I said, it was a very tough statement that he made. He also compared the situation in Gaza to Hitler's war in Europe and said, and I'm quoting him here, he said, just as Hitler was stopped with an alliance of humanity 70 years ago from today, so must Netanyahu and his network of murder be stopped by an alliance of humanity. I mean, does that kind of language from Turkey, I should say, which is a NATO member state, does that surprise you?
Well, I think Erdogan also is playing somewhat to a domestic public attitude in Turkey. It's a predominantly Muslim country. The issue of Palestine is very strong in Turkey. Erdogan's government has less support than it did once upon a time. This is a very big issue for all the people of the region, especially Muslim or majority Muslim countries. Yeah. But when people like Erdogan, and of course Erdogan, Turkey is the eastern flank of NATO, talk like that, it says a lot about the level of polarization in the world. And I think that part is definitely real.
Anton, before the start of the General Assembly, UN Secretary General Guterres, he talked of the need for the UN to be modernized, for there to be reform. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
Global institutions and frameworks are today totally inadequate to deal with these complex and even existential challenges. And it's no great surprise. Those institutions were born in a bygone era for a bygone world. So many of the challenges that we face today were not on the radar 80 years ago when our multilateral institutions were born.
So, Anton, what are the chances of major reform at the United Nations? You know, the Brazilian President Lula da Silva, he has called for the Security Council, for instance, to be reconfigured in some way. But I'm wondering, you know, why a country like the United States would agree to something like that, because it would seriously dilute their power at the United Nations. The United States has shown us that it can undo what possibly the other 192 members may think just with one vote.
Yes, that's right. And that goes for the other 4 members, permanent members of the Security Council, although the United States is probably going to be the greatest obstacle to any kind of meaningful reform of the Security Council or the United Nations more broadly. But the issue here, I think, Anand, is not really reforming the United Nations. I think General Secretary Guterres was pointing to a very important factor about the context in which the UN was created. It was created in a bipolar world with 2 superpowers in charge of 2 camps that, as Brian, I think, mentioned a little bit earlier today, acted for all of their faults, especially that of the socialist camp under the Soviet Union, but they acted as checks upon each other. That's actually why the United Nations worked. Since the end of the Cold War and the dismantlement of the Soviet Union, that check and balance on the United States disappeared. And so the United Nations, which was never actually an independent sovereign actor on the world stage anyway, but at least it was a stage upon which actors could agree to seriously and, for the most part, although not always conscientiously, debate issues. Once the world became unipolar, the UN simply stopped mattering. And so the United States and its NATO allies, we know the record is clear, went on invasions that were not authorized by the United Nations on multiple occasions, Yugoslavia, Iraq, and so on and so forth. Look, the UN is a barometer. It is a tool that reflects the function or dysfunction of the world. And so it's not really the reform of the United Nations that's going to fix this problem. It is the context itself, the environment in which it exists, that needs to recalibrate and rebalance itself to become truly multipolar, and then the UN will become a functional organization again. For now, by the way, most countries are moving towards regional organizations, regional security, regional economic issues, because that seems to be the way that most countries want to solve their problems.
Ali Akbar Dareini, there was an analysis in the Wall Street Journal on Tuesday, a very candid analysis on the situation in the Middle East and these heightened tensions that we see. And in that analysis, the Wall Street Journal said that, you know, if there's a possibility that Israel would again consider a ground invasion of Lebanon, then they would be faced with a vast Hezbollah arsenal. And the newspaper said Israel could find itself in another quagmire given Hezbollah's sophisticated weapons. What did you make of that?
I agree with that. Hezbollah is not Hamas. Lebanon is not Gaza. Israel will get stuck if it's going to invade Lebanon while its aggression against Lebanon is now limited to airstrikes. But the fact that Lebanon is hitting military targets 55 kilometers deep inside Israel shows that despite the pager explosions, Hezbollah is in a position to make life hell for Israel. Yeah. While Iran is trying to make sure that it will support Hezbollah and will do whatever is necessary to do so, Iran feels there is no need for itself to get involved because Hezbollah appears to be strong enough to deter Israel, and this is not going to be, right, another Gaza.
Brian, when we talk about the United Nations, we often talk about the proceedings at the Security Council, but more recently we've seen what goes on in other agencies like the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. I mean, they've made rulings which have been ignored by Israel without consequence, I should say. I mean, what needs to change there? How can these organizations work without any kind of enforcement mechanism?
Only if the target of the court happens to coincide with America's targets. Let's not forget that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is being the target of U.S. sanctions now because it dared earlier to say that U.S. personnel in Afghanistan should be held responsible for crimes against humanity and for perhaps issuing an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu. Yeah. The U.S. has said that the ICC, to which the United States is not a signatory, cannot have any jurisdiction over Americans. So if Americans commit war crimes in Vietnam or Korea or elsewhere, they're not subject. So these institutions, which are badly needed and supported, aren't really, they can't thrive without U.S. support.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. We have run out of time, but thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. And stay with us all week for more interviews with global leaders from the 79th session of the UN General Assembly. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.